The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. A hired man who is not a shepherd and whose sheep are not his own sees a wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf catches and scatters them. This is because he works for pay and has no concern for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know mine, and mine know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I will lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. These also I must lead, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock, one shepherd. This is why the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own. I have power to lay it down and power to take it up again. This command I have received from my Father. The Gospel of the Lord. Today's reading from the book of Acts, we hear about the scene in which Peter encountered some Gentiles from Caesarea. There were men sent to him. He was living in a place called Joppa. And men were sent to him from Caesarea, sent by a man named Cornelius, who had had a vision of God. Cornelius was what was called a God-fearer, which meant that even though he was not Jewish, he was not a partaker of the covenant, he was not circumcised, and yet he considered himself a believer in God and a believer in Judaism. He would have attended the synagogue and other feasts, but he wouldn't have been allowed to participate fully. In a very real sense, it's kind of like somebody who is a catechumen in our church, someone who claims to believe what we believe, but is not yet able to participate in the sacraments. And what we see in this story is that these men were sent to Peter, and before he was able to baptize them, they had already received the Holy Spirit. Cornelius had seen a vision from God, but even more than that, when they arrived at Peter's home, they received the Holy Spirit. And people were criticizing Peter for baptizing these Gentiles. This is before they had the Council of Jerusalem, in which it was discussed whether circumcision was necessary to be baptized or not. Now, I think there's a couple of things that we can take from this story. First of all, we should always be weary of placing limitations on the Holy Spirit. Notice that these men received the Holy Spirit before they ever received the sacraments. One of the great mysteries of the Christian life is that God has chosen to make sacraments necessary for salvation, and yet God can still work outside of the sacraments. God can still work outside of the institutional Catholic Church. God can still work in souls that seem to be totally lost. So we should never put prohibitions on the Holy Spirit. Now, another aspect of this vision, which I want to speak about, is the vision that Peter had. So Cornelius had a vision, but also Peter had a vision, and that was recounted in the reading today. Peter recounts the story to the circumcised party, as they are called in the book of Acts, who were criticizing him for baptizing these Gentiles. And what happened in Peter's vision is, as he was there in Joppa, he was on the roof, and he found himself to be hungry. And he fell into a trance or a vision in which Peter saw something descending from the sky, something that was like a sheet filled with wild beasts who were considered unclean in the Jewish law. And God told him to get up, slaughter, and eat. And Peter responded that he would never do so because they were unclean, and he's never eaten unclean food. And God tells him that what he has made clean, Peter was not to call profane. Right, what is the meaning of this vision? First of all, an easy way to remember this vision, some people call this the pigs in a blanket vision that Peter had. And what was the significance of those unclean foods being declared clean from now on? In some ways, it was symbolic of the fact that Gentiles were now going to be admitted to the covenant. In another sense, it was the revelation that Jewish Christians no longer had to follow the old dietary laws of the Old Testament. I think there's kind of some hidden meaning in this. At one level, it's those surface level meanings, but I think it's also something for us to understand. What was the purpose of all of those dietary laws in the Old Testament? The purpose of those dietary laws in the Old Testament was never meant to be something permanent. It was something that was necessary in that day. The reason why God gave so many dietary laws and other passing laws to the Jews is because He wanted them to be set apart from all of the other nations of the world. And they needed to be set apart because if they were not set apart by these different practices, they would easily succumb to the religion of other nations around them. And rather than being a nation set apart, a light for the world, they would become just like everybody else. Many of those laws were motivated by a spirit of fear. Kind of like laws that you give to your children when they're younger. Right? You're much more restrictive of your children when they're younger because they don't yet have the power and the intellect and the virtue to freely choose good and safe things. So you have more laws that hinder them. I think in a certain sense, God removing those dietary laws is revealing to us that now that we have received the Holy Spirit, now that we have received the church, we no longer should be motivated by a spirit of fear. I think many of us in our age, when we think about the faith in terms of the world which is more secular, or when we think about speaking to non-Catholic Christians, sometimes we can be very defensive, and we feel like we have to make a case for the faith. Or we get afraid when people question us about the faith. We feel like we're attacked verbally and mentally. People try to convert us to a different denomination. What is our reaction? Are we afraid? Are we timid? Are we offended? Do we feel like we have to build up our walls to protect ourselves? I think we should be inspired by this vision. We no longer need to be motivated by fear. The faith is an unstoppable force in the midst of the world, and everybody should want to be a part of it. We don't have to go about being defensive or overly protective about the faith. The faith can speak for itself, and the Holy Spirit will continue to move about the world, bringing about conversion of hearts and conversion of souls.